here's a painting. Not sure if you're familiar with this painting, but this is a painting that of the Last Supper, which is obviously a very well-known story around the world. It's a painting by Leonardo da Vinci from the 15th century, late 15th century. Now, this painting would probably be one of the world's most celebrated paintings. If you wanted to go and borrow it, I'd love for you to come and tell me how that worked out for you, because apparently this painting is worth somewhere around $450 million. It's owned by the National Museum of Italy, and it's displayed currently, apparently, in a Catholic church in Milan, in Italy. And you can actually, if you go there, I don't know if has anyone been there to see this? You can actually pay money to go on a tour and see it. So, the Last Supper is a very well-known story. What are we meant to see from it? What are we meant to learn? What's it all about? What are the key things we meant to understand from that whole story? A really, really important story. Well, tonight, what I want to do is explore the messages that come out of these Last Supper passages. And these passages, Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, John 13 and 1 Corinthians 11, form a group of passages from which we get a composite picture of the Last Supper. They all add different pieces of information that we can put together and get a really good picture about what actually happened. So tonight, just with the amount of time we've got, we're going to look at 4 key aspects or events that I want to explore a little bit more that happened around the Last Supper. So these 4 events are the concept of the Passover and how that related to the Last Supper, the identification of Judas as the betrayer, the obvious reference to the bread and the wine as a memorial instruction, and this beautiful story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So they're the 4 things I'd like to cover tonight. So the first one we want to look at is this concept of the Passover. It's Jesus and his disciples gathered together to enjoy this or share a Passover meal. There's no doubt about that. And the gospel records are at pains to sort of emphasise this. So you get, I think it's in Matthew 3 times it's mentioned, in Mark 4 times it's mentioned, this idea of the Passover meal, and in Luke 6 times. And the Passover was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which went for 7 days. The Jews hold it every year, and they have been since the first Passover and Exodus, which was roughly about, 1,500 years ago. What actually happened? What do we know happened during that Passover? Well, we know that at that time, at the Passover and associated Exodus, the people of Israel were slaves in Egypt and they were set free to a new beginning out of that harsh, horrible environment of Egypt. That they were set free. And on that Passover night, they killed a Passover lamb, a lamb without blemish, and they ate it with unleavened bread, and they used the blood and they put it on the doorposts. And that was pretty important because the angel of death looked at that and passed over their house, and the firstborn within that house was saved. Whereas everybody else who didn't have that blood over that doorpost, the angel of death entered and the firstborn were killed. So there was that aspect of the Passover night. There was the wonders that surrounded the whole concept of the Passover. So all the plagues of Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, and so on. At the time of the Passover too, it's important to remember that Israel weren't going fantastic spiritually. It says they were really involved with idol worship. That's a very important thing to remember. So they were very astray from where God wanted them to be. They were idol worshippers. And the other thing we know about the Passover, that the Passover and the Exodus from Egypt happened on the exact day that God had predicted and promised to Abraham 400 years earlier. So there's some really key concepts around the Passover, and it's a big deal to the Jews. It's a big deal to the Jews. It's the most referred to event in the Jewish history of when you look through the Old Testament. The interesting thing is in Exodus 12, the Jews, Israel's told to keep it as what's called a holy convocation. And that means an assembly, but it also has the idea of being a rehearsal. So the whole point from this was that this whole concept of the Passover and everything that happened was like a rehearsal for a future bigger event, which was obviously pointing forward to the day of Jesus Christ, when Jesus Christ came as the perfect Passover lamb. So you had people like John the Baptist, when Jesus arrived, he would point him out and say, "Behold the Lamb of God," in reference to the Passover lamb. There's numerous references all through the New Testament about Jesus being the Passover lamb that was sacrificed for us. He had no blemish, he was sinless. And there's so much imagery around that based on the original Passover. And of course, when Jesus came, humanity was, in a sense, set free from sin and death. And to be set free, people needed to respond to what was being offered, the offer of new life by the grace despite their sins. And around the crucifixion, in the same way, there were wonders of God that were displayed. There was, the earthquakes and the darkness. The veil of the temple was miraculously ripped in half. And there was, of course, the resurrection afterwards. And all that happened the day Jesus was crucified. It happened on a day, a set time, a set date that was appointed. There were key prophecies and time periods that Jesus himself knew, and he was expecting his crucifixion, the sacrifice of the Passover lamb, to happen. And through his ministry, you hear him talking about his time. His time had come. And there's an example here in John 13 and verse 1. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end." So Jesus was fully aware of when his time, that time of crucifixion, would be. He knew all the details about it. And so to him, the Passover was a big deal, this concept of this Passover meal. And when you think about it, there would have been, I guess, roughly 1,500 Passovers from the original one. And the one that he was celebrating in the Last Supper with his disciples was the most important, the most significant. Because when you think about it, think about the pressure on Jesus Christ, knowing that this Passover was the most significant and most important, because every person, every sinner of faith that lay dead in the grave, that was alive and that was to come, all relied on him and his perfect sacrifice. And not only that, he knew all the details about how horrific his suffering would be. And as you can imagine, there would be that associated anxiety. And we read of that and that pressure and that pain that he went through. I want you to pause for a minute and think, if that was you, if you knew all those details. Say, for example, you were going to go to Adelaide and you know that there was going to be a plane crash on that plane that you were on, and that plane was going to crash in a remote mountain. You were going to survive the plane crash, but you would have horrific injuries and lie in that wilderness for 6 hours before you died. And you knew, in 2 weeks' time, that was going to happen to you. How would you feel as every day that came closer and closer and closer? So when Jesus had this Passover meal, it says of him that he had fervent desire to eat that Passover before he suffered with his disciples. So if that was you and you knew the date of your death and you had a meal that you were going to have on the day before you died, think about how special that meal would be with all your friends. That's exactly the feeling of Jesus, of how significant that meal was to his friends and how special that was. So, yes, a great time of stress, a great time of anxiety, but how precious that time was, as he said. I really fervently desire it, and there's so much emotion in that statement. So the Passover, so significant in the last concept in the story of the Last Supper. The other great stress of Jesus' life at this time was, of course, that Judas would be identified as the betrayer. The thing is, Jesus knew from the beginning that Judas would betray him. It says in John 6 that Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who would betray him. And interestingly, in John 6, he also says in verse 70 to 71, I did not choose you, did I not choose you, the 12, and one of you is a devil? He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. So he knew that one of them was a devil, and as we know from the Greek, that word is the Greek word diabolos, which simply means basically a false accuser or a transgressor or a slanderer. So this term, and this is a whole subject in itself, isn't it? Devil and Satan. But simply we just wanted to mention that this is a term he used and applied to Judas, who was a betrayer, a slanderer, and a false accuser of Jesus. And if we had more time, and on another time, we would look at the way devil and Satan is used in the Bible. It's not a supernatural being, as many believe. The way we need to understand that is explore figures of speech and things like personification to understand the real meaning of devil and Satan in the scriptures. If Jesus knew that Judas was going to betray him from the beginning, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, to me, anyway, that the identity and the location of the Last Supper, where it was held, was kept secret. It was sort of random. So we're told that two of the disciples, which are Peter and John, when you compare the records, go and meet this man carrying a pitcher of water, and it's just like this random event. And you can understand that when you look back at this, how Jesus knew that he would be betrayed by Judas. He didn't want the location of that Last Supper that he craved to have disturbed. So this is a big deal to Jesus. In the 1 Corinthians 11 passage, it says, the Lord Jesus, the same night in which he is betrayed. It makes a big point of that. And I think the reason it says that, in the same night in which he was betrayed, he took bread, the writer Paul wants us to feel for Jesus, knowing that this event too would have created great stress and anxiety for him. It's a bizarre thing, isn't it, when you think about the life of Judas? Like, Judas walked and talked and spoke with Jesus. He saw the miracles. He listened to what he said. He looked at that beautiful character every day, and yet he betrayed Jesus, betrayed him. And the question is why? And there's been lots of suggestions as to why Judas betrayed Jesus. And, one of the ones which is, I suppose, has merit is that Judas expected Jesus to be the king that would rescue the Jews from the Romans and overthrow the Romans, and he was disappointed when he realised that wasn't his mission. But I think the Bible itself gives us probably the most accurate clue, and that is that Judas was a lover of money. You read of passages like John 12 when Mary is wiping Jesus' feet with this expensive oil and Judas is complaining about it, and it says he wasn't complaining about it being given to the poor. He was complaining about it because he was interested in the money, and it says that he was a thief and he used to knock off the money that came out of that box that was saved for the disciples' use. This is a classic statement of Judas when he goes to the Pharisees and the chief priests and he says in Matthew 26, "What are you willing to give me?" So you can see this focus on money that Jesus has, that mindset of him taking for his own personal wealth and profit. It's interesting in the story of the Last Supper. It's a very telling statement when Jesus identifies Judas as the betrayer. It says, immediately he went out. Do you remember this? What it says? And it was night. There was a darkness that surrounded that guy's mindset. So something for us to think about. The bread and the wine. Obviously in all the records, or most of the records, we're told that we are to have the bread and the wine in remembrance of Jesus. It's interesting, in the original Passover there wasn't any wine, and somehow along the way wine was introduced. And the Mishnah, which is the written oral or written collection of oral Jewish traditions, says the wine was introduced at some point, they don't know, to remind them of the blood of the Passover lamb. And obviously by the time they celebrated the Passover at the time of Jesus, wine was part of that meal. We read this nearly every Sunday, don't we? That the bread represents his body and the wine represents the blood of the new covenant. But I think the thing that I want you to notice that it says, both of them, it says, for you. For you. So there's this emphasis on Christ's sacrifice, isn't it? Of giving to his disciples. He gave of himself. And there's been discussion over the years about why is there two symbols, and there's so many answers to that. The specific sort of focus, when you specifically focus on the meaning of the bread and the meaning of the wine, but I feel like there's one primary meaning that is quite simple. That bread and wine are both used as, it's a double emphasis. It's a double emphasis to focus on the fact that he gave and sacrificed for you and me. It's a bit like when Abraham was told, your seed's going to be like the stars of the heaven and the sand of the seashore. There's an emphasis being made. And it's, when you think about the bread and wine, the way they're made or processed, they have very similar processes. They're a brutal process. Bread is made from grain that is pulverised at the start. and wine is made from grapes that are crushed in its process. So I feel that there is, primarily, there's lots of ways you can explore the bread and the wine and the symbology around it, and there are different meanings. But primarily I think we're meant to see this concept of sacrifice and the giving of Christ, and it's emphasised twice. And that's why I think, when you read of the New Testament believers in the first century, it says when they gathered together, it doesn't say that they gathered together to eat bread and drink wine. It says they gathered together for the breaking of bread, because the wine would have been incorporated in that. Do this in remembrance of me. This is what we hear most Sundays. What does this really mean? Well, obviously, there is an instruction that we have to get together to remind ourselves of the sacrifice of Christ, that his body was broken in that sense, and his blood was shed. That's a really important thing that we continue to remember. That's an instruction. But I think there's more to it than that, isn't there? Where this doing is this concept of giving our body and giving our blood, so to speak, in the same way that Jesus did in the sacrifice for each other. When you think about the passage in 1 Corinthians 11, do you remember this? The whole context of 1 Corinthians 11 is where that Corinthian ecclesia was coming together for their meal, their love feasts. And incorporated in that love feast was the bread and the wine. And they come there and they were completely selfish, where they were eating this meal and not thinking about others going hungry. And yet they were having the bread and the wine in remembrance of Jesus. So the first aspect of do this they were doing, but the whole meaning behind the doing they were neglecting. So what was more important? And that's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 says, examine yourself. Yeah, it's cool that you come together and use the bread and wine as those symbols to remember the sacrifice of Jesus. But are you living that? Are you doing that in your life? Examine yourself, he says. It's interesting, in John's the only gospel writer that does not record the bread and the wine memorial instruction. And I think that's because John, and it's well known that John is on a very much higher spiritual level than the other gospel writers. A much deeper thinker, or a deeper recorder of these events. And in John 6, he does mention this concept of the bread and wine. In John 6, it talks about how Jesus said, I am the bread of life. And he says, the bread is my body. Jesus said the bread was his body, just like the manna that came down. And then he challenges the people around him with this seemingly crazy statement where he says, if you've got to eat my flesh and drink my blood, and you'll have life. And a lot of people couldn't handle that. And he said in verse 56, if you do this, you're like eating the bread and drinking wine, you're assimilating that into your body. It's the same way. You've got to assimilate me into your life for you to have life eternally. So we're going to come to the part of the washing of feet, and we might have that reading now, Eden, from John chapter 13. And I just want to pull a couple of thoughts from that reading. So John 13, verse 1 to 17. Thanks.
John chapter 13, verses 1 to 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God. This is John 13. Is it John 13? Yeah, that's right. He riseth from supper and laid aside his garments, and took a towel and girded himself. After that he poureth water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. Peter saith unto him, Thou shalt never wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, If I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. Simon Peter saith unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus saith to him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all. For he knew who should betray him. Therefore said he, Ye are not all clean. So after he had washed their feet, and had taken his garments, and was set down again, he said unto them, Know ye what I have done to you? Ye call me Master and Lord, and ye say, Well, for so I am. Is that right, to verse 13? 17. If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If ye know these things, happy are ye if ye do them.
Thanks, Tony. It's pretty specific to John. He's the only one that mentions this story of the washing of the disciples' feet by Jesus. And I think the precursor to this is in Luke 22, where, and this is only recorded in Luke, where the disciples are sitting around during this Last Supper and they're arguing about who's going to be the greatest. And there's this beautiful part of that story in Luke 22 where Jesus steps in and he says, the greatest person is the person that serves. And he said, I'm a king. And you know what happens with most kings? Most kings sit at a table and the servants come around and serve him and fuss over that king. He said, I'm not like any ordinary king. I am the king that sits everyone at the table, and I'm the one that serves him. And that's the point he makes. He says greatness is about service. Talking about a king, in John 13, we read here that in verse 3 it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things. When you think about that for a minute, he is the preeminent one, as it says in many passages of the Bible, in Colossians and so on. He is the preeminent one, the richest one, the most important one, the one the whole world pivots around, and he's there serving his disciples at a table. That's what it says in Luke 22. And John 13 sort of is the sequel to this, where he gets down and starts washing his disciples' feet. This is the king of the world, the king of the universe, the king of history. And I love in verse 15, he says this, he says, For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Do you see what's happening here? John doesn't mention the memorials like the other Gospels, but he incorporates the concept here, where he says, you should do this as I've done to you. I've given you this example. And in verse 17, the same things. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. And then in chapter 14 and verse 23, and I think this is still part of the upper room or the Last Supper conversation, because at the end in verse 31 it says, arise, let us go from here. There's a bit of a break there. But in verse 23, Jesus also says, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word. And my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home in him. So it's like the bread and the wine. When you eat on a Sunday morning, or whenever that happens, and you eat that bread and drink that wine, and it flows into your body and becomes part of you, you assimilate that into you. That's what John is on about here at a much deeper level. Jesus needs to live in us. He needs to become part of us. And that's what John means in this story. He's getting at in his story of the washing of the disciples' feet. This is his comment on this do. And he focuses on the more important this do aspect. To proclaim the pattern of Jesus living in you. So hopefully from tonight, in this brief time that we've had, I just wanted to highlight this concept of how all of these things came together and created, in that atmosphere of great anxiety and stress and hurt for Jesus Christ. Despite all that, he had this outward serving, giving mentality and mindset, even to Judas. Because it seems that he also gave the bread and the wine to Judas and shared that with him. It seems that Judas was there and he was one of the disciples that Jesus washed with all the others. And what I want you to think about is the disciples went home that night, went away that night, and they came back the next day. They saw this scene, and those words, this do, would have been echoing in their head. You know, years ago, I heard a phrase that I've never forgotten. It was a challenging phrase which was, and it was run by a Christian, in a Christian campaign, and it was, are you a fan or a follower? Have you ever heard that? Do you know the difference between a fan and a follower? A fan is someone who looks at what Jesus Christ did and the sacrifice that he'd made and applauds from the sidelines and says, I'm a fan of that. But a follower is someone who says, I will incorporate that and be motivated to walk like that man and do that in my life. So every Sunday we remember Jesus in the bread and the wine. But the challenge, I think, from this whole story of the Last Supper and those memorials is, does Jesus live in us? Does he dwell in us? Does he abide in us? So in family life, is it about what we can get? What we can take or what we can give? In our church or ecclesial life, is it about what we can take or what we can give? In our school, uni and work life, is it about what we can take or what we can give? In our dealings with those who we love, is it about what we can take or what we can give? In our dealings with those we don't love as much, is it about what we can take or what we can give? And especially in dealings with those Judases in our life that have hurt us, is it about what we can take or what we can give? Are we inward focused or outward focused? Do we have this mindset of Judas, the Judas mindset, which was, what are you willing to give me? Or do we have the Jesus mindset, which is for you, for you, for you? The challenge from this story is, are we a fan or a follower? Does Jesus dwell in us? So the message of the Last Supper is, this do. Thank you.